So in regard to Elon Musk, first, I think we have to wait to see what happens around the inauguration, whether or not when we reach the end of January we have a new administration headed by the Orange Menace. And so far those are the indications, but we have to see in case something changes. And so if the situation proceeds in this direction, then when you look at Musk's chart, you see is that in the near term, February becomes quite a complicated month in that there's a lot of Saturn floating around, specifically to one of his planets is Venus. And so that's going to bring up some pressures. And part of what's going on here with the astrology is to see what the person is doing with the transits, so that as further transits develop later in the year, there's a better sense on the way things will tend to go. And so, for example, post February, it does improve. In fact, it's quite good in that that same Venus will get Jupiter going over it as we go into the spring. But then in the pre-summer period, he has another major Saturn hit. And my suspicion would be that it would be related to the impulse to make a big change to something. That's a Saturn-Pluto situation there, and that's the kind of thing where you're doing some kind of major reconstruction. And this guy now is supported by many, many people, but also opposed by many, many people. When he was only involved in his own ventures, Tesla, the rocket ships and so on, you're going to attract less attention. But the way this is now playing out, it's completely different, and he's exposed to a lot more pressure, more trouble. And where this really begins to run into challenge is when we look at the later stages of 25, because what happens there is that same Saturn-Pluto pressure that he experiences in the pre-summer period is really magnified when we go into the fall of 2025 and into the early period of 2026. And then beyond that, we have the Saturn and Aries period, which we'll have a little bit of in the summer of this coming year in 25, but fully starting in the spring of 26. And so there is where the situation can really get dicey, because he's a Cancer sun sign. And I will say that he's a Cancer sun sign with his sun degrees conjoining the American Jupiter. And, that's a really fortunate, really helpful connection to a country. And it explains why the country has been so good for him, so profitable. He also has his rising degrees near the American sun and the fixed star Sirius, which can really empower a chart. So he definitely has some strong assets. There's no question about that. And indeed, you could add to this that going into next year, Jupiter, as I said a little bit earlier in this video, goes to his Venus. That's good. Then it goes into Cancer, which is his sun sign. So from the summer of 25 to the summer of 26, it's good. It's Jupiter going through there. It's expansive, protective, empowering, etc. However, when you go into 2026, then you have Saturn in Aries, and moving as the months are passing, moving toward squaring his sun, squaring his ascendant, and in the 10th sign. Now, the best thing that can happen to a person experiencing a Saturn through the 10th sign is the peak of their career, the peak of responsibility. But that assumes that things will go well, that they peak on the positive side. And Saturn there very frequently doesn't do that. For example, in the case of Kevin McCarthy, or more recently in the case of Kamala Harris, Saturn reaching the 10th sign was not good for her, and it certainly wasn't good for him. And part of it can be that if a person is incompetent, doesn't plan well, then certainly the odds increase that it'll show up exactly as that. And I think McCarthy really fits that particular description. In the case of Kamala Harris, I'm going to say less so. And that of course assumes that she doesn't become president, as this is the way it seems to be going. But assuming she does not, then it's peaked in the sense that the momentum collapsed. She didn't reach her goal, which was to reach, maximum power and responsibility. And there you can attribute it to potentially incorrect planning, but also, the fact that, big goals require all kinds of things to come together, and perhaps they simply didn't, which goes to show you how tricky the Saturn can be. And so when you see that in Musk's chart, and separately, you can also assess it as how is this person using Saturn, because that's the way their Saturn will tend to show up in their life. And there you have the qualities of responsibility, how moderate is the person in their approach, how aligned are they to their ambition, in the sense that it'll fit into society's needs in some wholesome way. And this is where his approach is quite questionable, and he radiates a sense that it's gone to his head. This guy is really, really wealthy. He's making all kinds of assumptions about his own power, his impact on the world. There's often no worse scenario for an individual than to think they are a lot smarter than they are. And so then you get a Saturn going through there, and that can be hugely problematic. And this is why I said in a prior video that for me it's encouraging to see someone who may be setting himself up to have a lot of influence in our government for the next while. But the Saturn reaching that point in 2026, coincident with the period when we're going to have an election, could be very problematic for him, and in that sense very helpful for those of us who feel that the MAGA movement needs to be checked, as well as any impulse to centralize power in any individual, particularly individuals such as this. So overall, the only problem with what I'm saying here is that in the immediate period of time, it's unlikely that you'll see this guy suffer in any kind of significant way. But give it enough time, and if there's a planet you can count on to push a person back, it's Saturn. There's no question. You can often figure out ways around the other planets. Saturn, there's no way. And if so, then he would find himself restricted, held back, including all the way to failing. And there's also, of course, the matter of his relationship with the Orange Man. And there, I won't say too much here. I'll just say this, though, that there are some really good points in their chart-to-chart alignments and in the composite chart, but there is also a distinct signature that is similar to Trump's relationship with his ex-lawyer fixer, Michael Cohen. And those are patterns where there's a lot of dynamism. And so there are people that stimulate each other to do things, to try things, but there's also a strong risk of something collapsing at some point. And when you're looking for those collapses and those, major disagreements, those, crash and burn situations, once again, what you need is Saturn paying you a visit, and Saturn in that place in 2026 for both of them is really problematic, and therefore signals the possibility of that kind of breakdown.